Chapter 1. The quiet after. The house didn't echo exactly, but it carried sound differently now. Martin Baxter noticed it most in the mornings. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder. The click of the coffee maker had too much presence. Even his footsteps felt intrusive, like he was a guest in his own life who didn't quite know where to stand. At 38, Martin had lived most of his adult life in motion for someone else. Up early for work, home in time for dinner, homework help, late-night talks, weekend errands. A marriage that had been steady and functional and eventually complete. Now, on a Tuesday morning that didn't require anything of him beyond showing up to his job and paying his bills, he stood in his kitchen holding a mug he didn't remember buying, staring out the window at a street that hadn't changed at all. Pearl would have liked the quiet, he thought. His daughter had always been better at stillness than he was. Even as a kid, she'd sit cross-legged on the floor with a book, perfectly content to let the world happen around her. College suited her. She'd told him that over the phone last week, her voice bright with new independence. "I think I finally get why you liked routine so much," she'd said. "It makes the exciting stuff feel earned." He'd smiled at that, proud and a little stunned that she could see him so clearly from so far away. The divorce had been like that too, clear. No shouting, no betrayal, no courtroom bitterness. Just a long conversation that finally admitted what they both already knew. They weren't the same people who'd promised forever at 18, standing on the edge of adulthood with more hope than understanding. They'd hugged at the end. A real hug, the kind that acknowledged history without asking it to stay. "I want you to be happy," his ex-wife had said. "I want that too," he'd replied, surprised to realize he meant it for both of them. They didn't keep in touch. That wasn't cruelty. It was kindness. Martin took a sip of coffee and grimaced. Too strong. He'd never learned how to make it properly because someone else always had. Another small thing he was figuring out late. His phone buzzed on the counter. Mark flashed across the screen. "You awake?" his brother's voice said when Martin answered. "Unfortunately," Martin replied. "What do you want?" Mark laughed. "That's the spirit. You still coming by tonight?" "I said I would." "You said you'd think about it." "Thinking counts." "It does not," Mark said. "I need a yes or a no." Martin leaned against the counter, watching a pair of joggers pass outside. "Yes. Good. I found a space." "That fast?" "Turns out when you're not trying to impress anyone, negotiations go smoother." Martin smiled despite himself. Mark had always been like that, direct to the point of irritation. Older by 4 years, divorced himself, with a confidence that seemed to come from surviving disappointment and deciding it wasn't fatal. "What kind of space?" Martin asked. "Small. Cheap. Kind of ugly. Perfect." "For what, exactly?" Martin said. "We still haven't defined that part." "That's tonight's problem," Mark said. "You're finally free, little brother. Try not to waste it by overthinking." After they hung up, Martin stayed where he was, phone warm in his hand. Free. It was a word people said to him now like it came with balloons. Friends from work, distant relatives, even Pearl once, gently, like she was offering permission. But freedom didn't feel like relief. It felt like standing in an empty room with a single chair and no instructions. He finished his coffee, poured the rest down the sink, and rinsed the mug. At work, Martin did what he always did. Handled accounts, answered emails, nodded through meetings. He was good at his job. Reliable. Thoughtful. The kind of man people trusted without thinking too hard about why. It had been enough before. By the time evening came, he drove across town to meet Mark, rehearsing reasons the business idea might fail. They lined up neatly in his head, familiar as old habits. The space Mark had mentioned sat above a closed-down bakery. The stairwell smelled faintly of sugar and dust. Inside, the room was narrow, with exposed brick and a single large window that faced west. "It's awful," Martin said automatically. Mark grinned. "You love it." "I don't." "You do. You just don't know how yet." Martin stepped farther in, setting his jacket over the back of a folding chair. The place felt unfinished. Raw. It didn't demand anything from him except imagination. "What are we doing here, Mark?" he asked. "Starting something," Mark said simply. "Together. You don't need the money like you used to. Neither do I. We're not 20. We don't have to be impressive." Martin let out a slow breath. "I don't even know what I want." "That," Mark said, clapping him on the shoulder, "is finally not someone else's problem." Martin laughed, short, surprised, a sound he hadn't made in a while. Later, as the sun dipped low and filled the room with gold, Martin felt something loosen in his chest. Not joy, not certainty, possibility. He didn't know yet that this space would introduce him to someone who would challenge his careful solitude. He didn't know how laughter would creep back into his days, uninvited and welcome. All he knew was that for the first time in his adult life, the future wasn't already spoken for. And that scared him, and quietly thrilled him. Chapter 2, Terms and Conditions. By Thursday, the idea of the business had begun to feel uncomfortably real. Martin noticed it when he started waking up early again. Not because anyone needed him to, but because his mind refused to stay quiet. Possibility, it turned out, was louder than obligation. It rattled around his head, asked questions, made suggestions, and offered absolutely no instructions. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan until 7, then gave up and made himself eggs he slightly overcooked. Improvement, he decided, was incremental. The office, if it could be called that yet, smelled faintly of paint and dust. Mark was already there when Martin arrived after work, sleeves rolled up, tape measure hooked onto his belt like he'd been born wearing it. "You're late," Mark said. "I'm on time," Martin replied, checking his watch. "Emotionally late," Mark clarified. "I've been here for an hour imagining all the ways this could fail." Martin smiled. "That's my job." "Good," Mark said. "Then we're already delegating." They sat at a folding table borrowed from Mark's garage, paperwork spread between them. There was something oddly intimate about it. Numbers, signatures, decisions. Martin hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd signed something that didn't affect anyone but himself. "What exactly are we calling this?" Martin asked, tapping the blank line at the top of the form. Mark leaned back in his chair. "I was thinking Baxter and Baxter." Martin winced. "That sounds like a law firm that specializes in parking tickets." "Fine," Mark said. "Baxter Brothers." "Worse. Baxter Solutions." "Meaningless." Mark narrowed his eyes. "You're doing this on purpose." "Probably," Martin admitted. "I've spent 20 years naming things carefully. Eventually, they settled on something serviceable and vague enough to grow into. It felt less important than Martin had expected. The name didn't matter as much as the act of choosing. Around 7, there was a knock at the open door. A woman stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that suggested mild skepticism was her default setting. She was around Martin's age, maybe a little younger, with dark hair pulled back loosely and glasses she kept pushing up with one finger. "Hi," she said. "I'm here about the lease." Mark stood. "You must be Claire," she said, already stepping inside. "I manage the property for the owner. He's very excited someone wants this space." "That makes one of us," Mark said cheerfully. Martin stayed seated, watching her scan the room. Her eyes were sharp but amused, like she was cataloging problems for sport. "You know the plumbing on this floor is temperamental," she said. "And the heat takes commitment." "Commitment I have," Mark replied. "Money I do not." Claire nodded. "Honesty. Refreshing." She finally looked at Martin. Really looked at him. Not the polite glance people gave strangers, but the assessing kind, curious without being invasive. "And you are?" she asked. "Martin," he said, standing a second too late. "Baxter. One of the Baxters." "Ah," she said. "The quieter one." He blinked. "Do I seem quiet?" She smiled, just slightly. "Compared to him?" She jerked her head toward Mark. "Yes." Mark beamed. "See? You already have a brand." They went through the lease line by line. Claire explained things plainly, without salesmanship or apology. Martin found himself appreciating that. She didn't try to soften the building's flaws or dress them up as charm. At one point, Mark excused himself to take a call, leaving Martin and Claire alone at the table. "You look like you're waiting for someone to tell you you're allowed to be here," she said suddenly. Martin laughed before he could stop himself. "Is it that obvious?" "Only if you've spent a lot of time being needed," she said. "You get used to permission." He considered that. "Do you do this a lot?" "Read strangers. Only the interesting ones," she replied, then added, "Kidding. Mostly." When Mark returned, Claire slid the final page across the table. "Sign here, and here, and here." Martin took the pen. His hand hesitated for just a moment. This wasn't a marriage license. It wasn't a mortgage. It wasn't a promise meant to last forever. It was a risk. A small one. He signed. After Claire left, Mark clapped his hands together. "That's it. We're business owners." Martin exhaled. "I think I'm going to throw up." "You won't," Mark said. "You'll adapt. You always do." Later that night, Martin sat alone in his living room, paperwork stacked neatly on the coffee table. He called Pearl, because some reflexes didn't disappear overnight. "I did a thing," he said. Her grin came through the phone. "Good thing or I need bail money thing?" "Business thing." "Dad," she said, delighted. "That's amazing." He felt something warm settle in his chest. Not pride exactly. Validation, maybe. After they hung up, he found himself thinking. Not about the business or the empty house, but about Claire. Her easy confidence. The way she'd seen him without trying. He told himself it was nothing. Just novelty. Just a person connected to a project. Martin wasn't looking for a relationship. But as he turned off the lights and headed upstairs, he realized something else entirely had begun. Curiosity. Chapter 3. Incidental contact. Martin did not mean to see Claire again so soon. That, at least, was what he told himself when he noticed her standing outside the building on Saturday morning. Keys in hand, sunglasses pushed into her hair. He had come by to measure the office windows for blinds. Something practical, something neutral, something that did not involve people who could read him too easily. She looked up as he locked his car. "Oh," she said. "It's you." The word you landed with unexpected weight. "Hi," Martin replied. immediately annoyed with how much thought he put into the single syllable. I didn't know you'd be here. I didn't know you'd be here, she said. Which means neither of us is trespassing. A win for everyone. He smiled. I'm just measuring. Ah, she said. The most thrilling phase of entrepreneurship. They stood there for a moment, the silence not awkward exactly, but unclaimed. Martin realized he was waiting. For Mark, for an excuse, for instructions. None came. Do you want to come up? He asked, then immediately added, I mean not like, just to see the space, since you manage it. Professionally. Claire raised an eyebrow. I didn't think it was a date, Martin. Good, he said quickly. Because it's not. She laughed, and the sound was easy, unguarded. Relax. I was teasing. Inside, the office looked different in daylight. Less romantic, more honest. Dust motes floated through the sunbeam cutting across the floor. So, Claire said, hands on her hips. What's the plan? World domination or modest success? Modest, Martin said. Very modest. Possibly invisible. She nodded approvingly. Ambition is overrated. He moved around the room with the tape measure, calling out numbers. She wrote them down, unasked, as if they'd been doing this together for years. You're good at this, he said. At standing around with a clipboard? At knowing where to stand, he clarified. You don't get in the way. She looked at him then. Really looked, and something in her expression softened. You noticed that sort of thing. I had a lot of practice, he said, then wished he hadn't. But Claire didn't press. She rarely did, he was starting to realize. She let things exist without interrogation. When they finished, she capped the pen and glanced at her watch. I'm getting coffee. You're welcome to not join me. Martin hesitated. He hadn't planned on coffee. He hadn't planned on company. He hadn't planned on how easily his no-relationship rule bent under casual invitation. Sure, he said. I mean, okay. The cafe down the street was small and warm, the kind of place that wrote affirmations on chalkboards and played music no one recognized but everyone pretended to enjoy. They sat at a corner table, knees almost touching. So, Claire said, stirring her drink. Why now? Why now what? Why now on the business? On the risk? Martin watched the foam settle in his cup. Because I finally can. That's not the same as wanting to. No, he agreed. It's not. She waited. Not silently exactly but patiently. He found himself filling the space. I spent my whole adult life being needed, he said. And I don't regret it. I really don't. But now, no one's waiting on me to come home. No one needs me to decide dinner or fix something or be steady. And that feels disorienting, he said. Like I've been holding my breath for 20 years, and now I don't know how to inhale without doing it for someone else. Claire nodded. That makes sense. He looked up, surprised. It does. Yes, she said. People think freedom is loud. But it's quiet at first. Too quiet. They talked then, not deeply, not lightly, but comfortably. About Mark. About her job. About Pearl, whose absence Martin spoke of with pride instead of sadness, to his own surprise. You're not lonely, Claire observed. No, he said. I'm unused. She smiled at that. They ran into each other again the following week, then again after that. Always incidental. Always unplanned. Martin told himself it was logistics, proximity, coincidence, but he noticed when she changed her route to walk past the office. Noticed when she asked how he was doing, not the business. Noticed how easily he laughed around her, how little he edited himself. One evening, they stood outside the building watching the sky turn pink. You're very careful, she said. I have been, he corrected. She tilted her head. Are you done being that? He considered the question. I don't know. That's an honest answer. He hesitated, then said, I'm not looking for a relationship. I didn't ask, she replied gently. The silence that followed wasn't rejection. It wasn't agreement either. It was something new. As Martin drove home that night, he realized the business wasn't the only thing he'd started without a plan. And for once, he didn't immediately step away from the unknown. Chapter 4. The shape of freedom. Freedom, Martin discovered, had a learning curve. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with a montage or a sudden personality shift. It showed up quietly, disguised as small decisions that no one else cared about. What to eat for dinner, whether to go home right after work or linger, which version of himself to present when no one required anything at all. The business helped. The office was still more potential than reality, but it gave his days a second spine, something that wasn't obligation but wasn't aimless either. He and Mark spent evenings arguing over paint samples, supply costs, and what counted as good enough when perfection wasn't the goal. You're still trying to optimize for everyone, Mark said one night, kneeling on the floor with a drop cloth. There is no everyone. It's just us. That's worse, Martin replied. You're very difficult to please. I'm easy to please, Mark said. I just don't need you to disappear while doing it. That comment followed Martin home. He stood in his kitchen later, chopping vegetables for a meal that was already more elaborate than necessary, and realized how often he'd made himself smaller out of habit. Not resentfully, not consciously, just efficiently. Needs first, wants later. Later eventually became never. Now later had arrived without instructions. Claire drifted in and out of his days with similar subtlety. She didn't insert herself. She didn't demand attention. She was simply present. Sometimes she stopped by the office with paperwork. Sometimes she texted him a photo of something absurd in the building, an ancient radiator labeled "Do Not Touch" in 3 different languages. They never named what they were doing. Martin told himself that was intentional, careful, responsible. But there were moments, brief, unguarded moments, when he felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not longing exactly. Recognition. One afternoon, he found her sitting on the stairs outside the building, shoes off, notebook balanced on her knee. "Taking a break?" he asked. "Thinking," she said, "which looks identical to doing nothing." He sat beside her. "What about?" "My sister," she said. "She's convinced she needs to be married by 35 or her life doesn't count." Martin snorted before he could stop himself. "That's aggressive, right?" Claire said. "She asked me what I was waiting for. And I told her I wasn't waiting," she said. "I was building something quieter." Martin felt that land somewhere deep. She didn't like that, did she? She did not. They sat in companionable silence. Martin realized he wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to be charming or impressive or useful. He was just there. That felt radical. Later that week, Pearl called him, her voice buzzing with end-of-semester energy. "You sound different," she said. "Different good or different concerning?" "Different awake," she said. "Like you're not running on fumes." He smiled. "I think I stopped apologizing for existing." "That'll do it." After they hung up, Martin stared at his phone longer than necessary, then opened a message thread he hadn't planned to. "Martin, wanna grab dinner? No pressure." "Claire, I don't do pressure. I do tacos." "Martin, perfect." They met at a small place that served everything on paper trays and played music too loud for serious conversation. It was ideal. Claire talked about her job, about the strange intimacy of managing spaces people built their lives in. Martin talked about Pearl, about the business, about how strange it felt to want things without justification. "You don't owe anyone a reason," Claire said, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Except yourself. And even then, sometimes you can just want something because it fits." He looked at her across the table, at the easy certainty in her expression, and felt a flicker of panic. Fit was a dangerous word. When they walked outside afterward, the night was warm, the street buzzing with other people's lives. Claire tucked her hands into her jacket pockets. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said, then hesitated. "I think so. I'm just recalibrating." She nodded. "That's fair." They stopped at the corner, where the streetlight cast everything in yellow. "I meant what I said," Martin said, "about not looking for a relationship." "I know," Claire replied, "and I meant what I didn't say." He smiled despite himself. "Which was?" "That I'm not auditioning." Relief washed through him, followed closely by something else. Gratitude, maybe, or respect. They hugged, brief, unforced. When they pulled apart, neither lingered. At home, Martin lay awake longer than usual, replaying the evening. Not in a romantic haze, but in careful consideration. He realized something unsettling. He wasn't afraid of losing himself to another person. He was afraid of reshaping his life around someone else again, only to wake up years later unsure of who he'd been before the shape hardened. Freedom had edges, it turned out. The next morning, he told Mark he'd be taking a weekend off. "From what?" Mark asked. "From optimizing," Martin said. Mark grinned. "Good. Try something reckless. Like sleeping in." Martin did. He woke late, made bad pancakes, and went for a walk without a destination. He passed families, couples, solitary runners. None of it felt like something he was excluded from, just something he didn't have to define yet. That evening, he sat on his porch as the sun went down, phone buzzing with a message he didn't immediately open. Freedom wasn't empty anymore. It was taking shape. And that shape, he realized, was entirely his responsibility. Chapter 5, Old Reflexes. The problem with old reflexes was that they felt like wisdom. Martin realized this on a Wednesday afternoon when Claire asked a simple question and his entire body reacted like there was something to lose. They were standing in the office doorway, the place finally beginning to look like a real workspace instead of an abandoned idea. There were shelves now, a desk that wasn't borrowed, a plant Mark insisted would soften the vibe, despite being nearly indestructible and aggressively green. Claire leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely. "Are you coming to the open house thing on Friday?" "What open house thing?" Martin asked. She smiled. "Exactly. The one the building's doing. They want the new tenants to show up. Be visible. Human." "Oh," he said. "I hadn't planned on it." "That's fine," she said easily. "I just wanted to ask." He nodded, relief and disappointment arriving simultaneously. Then she added, "I was thinking of grabbing dinner after. With you. Not as a think thing. Just dinner." And there it was. The subtle tightening. The mental math. The reflexive scan for risk. Martin felt it before he understood it. The instinct to pull back just enough to stay safe. To reduce exposure. To optimize for minimal emotional cost. I don't know, he said. That week's kind of busy. Claire didn't challenge him. She didn't tease or push. She just nodded. Okay, she said. Let me know. After she left, the office felt smaller. Mark noticed it immediately. You just turned something down, he said, not looking up from his laptop. I didn't, Martin replied. I said maybe. That's a no wearing polite shoes. Martin frowned. I'm allowed to say no. Sure, Mark said. But you didn't say no because you didn't want to. You said no because you got uncomfortable. Martin bristled. You don't know that. Mark finally looked up. I know you. That night, Martin lay awake replaying the conversation. Not Claire's words, his own. The way he'd retreated without thinking. The way it had felt automatic, justified, even responsible. He told himself he was protecting his independence. But independence from what exactly? Friday came anyway. Martin showed up to the open house because it was good for the business. Because Mark would make it weird if he didn't. Because obligation, at least, was familiar. Claire was there, talking to a couple near the stairs, animated and relaxed. She caught his eye briefly, smiled, and went back to her conversation without changing course. That, unexpectedly, stung. They spoke later, politely, briefly. Nothing wrong. Nothing missing. And yet, everything felt thinner. Afterward, Martin went home alone and ate leftovers standing at the counter. The house felt too quiet again. Not empty this time, but unfinished. Like something had been paused mid-sentence. The next morning, Pearl called him. Dad, she said. You okay? Why does everyone keep asking me that? Because you sound like you're buffering. He laughed, then sighed. I think I messed something up. With who? He hesitated. With myself. Possibly with someone else. Pearl was quiet for a beat. You're allowed to want things, she said. You taught me that. You just never applied it to yourself. After they hung up, Martin sat on the edge of his bed, hands braced on his knees. He saw it clearly then, not as fear of commitment, not as caution, but as habit. He'd spent so long shaping his life around responsibility that when choice appeared, he treated it like a threat. He wasn't afraid of Claire. He was afraid of the version of himself that might choose her freely. That afternoon, he went to the office and found Claire's clipboard resting on the desk. She must have left it there intentionally, or maybe not. Either way, it felt like an invitation. He texted her. Martin, I handled Friday badly. Claire, you handled it honestly. That's not the same thing. Martin, I wasn't being honest. I was being careful. Claire, those are cousins, not twins. Martin, can I take you to dinner? As a thing or not a thing? Your choice. There was a pause long enough for doubt to creep in. Then, Claire, dinner. Friday. No optimization. At the restaurant, Martin didn't hedge. He didn't explain his past in disclaimers or preemptive apologies. He told her the truth. I don't want to disappear again, he said. And sometimes I mistake that fear for clarity. Claire listened, eyes steady. I don't want to be someone you build around instead of with. I know, he said. I'm learning how to tell the difference. She smiled. Good, because I'm not in a hurry. But I'm not invisible either. They walked afterward, the night cool and alive with other people's laughter. When they stopped at her car, Martin didn't pull away first. I'm not promising anything, he said. I'm not asking for promises, Claire replied. Just presence. He nodded. I can do that. As she drove off, Martin stood there longer than necessary, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not certainty. Choice. Chapter 6. Borrowed perspective. The call came on a Sunday morning, just after Martin had convinced himself he might finally be getting good at pancakes. His phone buzzed on the counter, Pearl's name lighting up the screen. He smiled before answering. Morning, he said. You're either very responsible or very hungover. Both can be true, Pearl said. But today I'm calling because I need your opinion. That's new, Martin said. What about? A boy, she said. Martin froze, spatula hovering midair. I'm sorry, I thought you said. I did, she said, amused. Relax. I'm not asking permission. I'm asking perspective. He turned the stove off and leaned against the counter. Okay, tell me. She talked while he listened, the way it had always been between them. Classmate. Smart. Kind. Complicated. Someone who made her feel seen and uncertain in equal measure. I don't know if I want something serious, she said. But I also don't want to pretend I don't care. Martin closed his eyes. That's a familiar dilemma, he said quietly. I thought so, Pearl replied. So what do you do when you don't want to disappear into something, but you don't want to walk away either? He considered the question, turning it over like a stone in his hand. You don't decide forever, he said finally. You decide now. You show up honestly. And you pay attention to whether you're becoming more yourself or less. Pearl was quiet for a moment. That's really good advice. He laughed. Don't tell anyone. It's mostly accidental. After they hung up, Martin stood there for a long time, the smell of overcooked batter filling the kitchen. He realized something unsettling and clarifying all at once. He had just given his daughter permission to do exactly what he'd been afraid to try himself. That afternoon, he went for a walk without headphones, letting the neighborhood noise fill the space. Kids on bikes, a dog barking behind a fence, someone practicing piano badly with determination. He thought about Claire, about how she never asked him to be anything other than present, about how he kept trying to negotiate the terms of something that hadn't demanded them. When he got home, he found a message from her waiting. Claire, I'm painting my kitchen and regret all my life choices. Want to help or just mock me? He smiled, a real one this time. Martin, mocking is a skill set I can offer responsibly. I'll bring food. Her apartment was a controlled chaos of paint cans, drop cloths, and half-finished decisions. Claire stood in the middle of it all, hands on her hips, hair tied back, a smear of blue on her cheek. You came, she said. I did, he replied. I'm trying something new. Helping? She asked, not overthinking. She studied him, then nodded. Bold strategy. They worked side by side, not talking much at first. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty but shared. At one point, Claire handed him a brush without comment, and he took it without asking what she needed. Later, they sat on the floor eating takeout from the cartons, backs against the wall. You seem lighter, she said. I talked to my daughter, he replied. She asked me for advice. And I realized I was giving her permission to choose without guarantees, he said. Something I haven't been very good at myself. Claire smiled softly. Learning goes both ways. He looked at her then. Not with caution, not with projection, but with clarity. I don't want to optimize this, he said. I don't want to preemptively protect myself from something that hasn't hurt me. She met his gaze. And what do you want instead? I want to keep choosing, he said, day by day, without shrinking. Claire considered that, then reached out and squeezed his hand once. Not possessive, not tentative, just present. That, she said, I can work with. They didn't define anything after that. They didn't need to. The evening ended with laughter, with paint on their clothes, with the quiet understanding that something had shifted. Not dramatically, but decisively. When Martin drove home later, windows down, night air cool against his face, he felt something settle into place. Choosing wasn't a loss of freedom. It was how freedom learned to breathe. Chapter 7. Choosing without obligation. The difference between habit and intention, Martin discovered, was surprisingly physical. Habit lived in his shoulders, in the way they tightened automatically when someone asked something of him. Intention lived lower, steadier, somewhere behind his ribs. It didn't flinch. It didn't rush. It waited for him to catch up. He noticed the distinction on a Tuesday morning when Mark texted him about a potential client meeting scheduled late. Mark, can you stay late tonight? Martin, I can, but I don't want to. Can we do tomorrow? The pause before Mark replied made Martin oddly nervous. Mark, yeah, tomorrow's fine. That was it. No pushback. No disappointment. No fallout. Martin stared at the screen for a long moment, then let out a quiet laugh. The world, it seemed, did not collapse when he spoke plainly. That evening, he met Claire for a walk along the river path near her apartment. The sky was low and gray, the air cool enough to warrant jackets. They fell into step easily, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Not accidentally, not deliberately either. You seem different again, Claire said. Good different or concerning different? She smiled. More settled. He nodded. I stopped negotiating with myself. About what? About whether I'm allowed to want things without justifying them, he said. Turns out I am. She glanced at him, amused and thoughtful. Bold. They stopped near the railing, watching the water move steadily past. Claire leaned her elbows against the metal, looking out instead of at him. I should tell you something, she said. He turned slightly, attentive but not braced. Okay. I don't want to slide into something undefined because it's comfortable, she said. I like you. I enjoy what we're doing. But I don't want to be a placeholder while you figure yourself out. Martin absorbed that without panic, without defense. The reflex to reassure, to promise, flickered, then settled. That's fair, he said. And I don't want to treat you like an experiment or a consequence of timing. She looked at him then, searching his face. So what do we do? He thought of Pearl's voice on the phone. Of the way Claire had squeezed his hand without expectation. Of the business slowly taking shape without demanding he vanish into it. We choose, he said. Not forever. Not with guarantees. Just deliberately. She considered that, then nodded. I can do deliberate. Me too, he said, surprising himself with how true it felt. They walked on, conversation drifting to lighter things. Bad movies, favorite sandwiches, the strange intimacy of routines you choose rather than inherit. Later, at her building, Claire stopped before the door. Do you want to come up? She asked. Not loaded. Not cautious. Just present. Martin felt the moment clearly. Not as a test. Not as a crossroads. But as an invitation that didn't erase the rest of his life. Yes, he said. I do. Inside, nothing dramatic happened. They talked. They laughed. They kissed, unhurried, exploratory, without the urgency of something being proven. When Martin left later, the night felt different than it had months ago. Not full of promise, exactly. Full of agency. At home, he sat on the edge of his bed, shoes still on, and took inventory. Not of what he'd gained, but of what he hadn't lost. He was still himself. Still a father. Still a brother. Still a man learning how to exist without erasing his own edges. Only now, he was choosing how to show up. The next morning, he texted Claire first. Martin, breakfast this weekend? Claire. Deliberately? Martin, very. Claire, then yes. Martin smiled, setting the phone down. For the first time in a long while, his life wasn't shaped by obligation or avoidance. It was shaped by choice. Chapter 8. A life that fits. By late spring, the business stopped feeling fragile. It wasn't thriving in a way that invited celebration or champagne, but it had momentum. Clients called back. Invoices were paid on time. The office no longer smelled like fresh paint or hesitation. It smelled like coffee and paper and something faintly electrical. Work happening. Martin noticed the change most in himself. He no longer braced when the phone rang. He didn't rehearse conversations before having them. He trusted his instincts, which turned out to be steadier than he'd given them credit for. The part of him that had spent years anticipating other people's needs didn't vanish, but it learned how to share space. Mark noticed too. You don't look like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore, Mark said one afternoon. Leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had just balanced the books, Martin shrugged. I think I realized there isn't another shoe. Just more floor. Mark snorted. Deep. You been reading philosophy now? No, Martin said. Just paying attention. Claire fit into his days the way good furniture fit a room. Not decorative, not overwhelming, just right. She didn't reorganize his life or demand access to every corner of it. They met for breakfasts that turned into afternoons. Walks that ended with groceries. Evenings that were sometimes quiet and sometimes full of laughter that surprised them both. They didn't merge calendars. They shared time. One Saturday, Martin drove out to visit Pearl at school. He brought groceries, a toolkit, and the strange mix of pride and restraint that came with watching his child build a life that no longer centered him. She introduced him to friends, showed him her favorite study spot, talked about plans that didn't require his approval or input. You're doing good, she told him as they walked across campus. I can tell. So are you, he said, and meant more than grades. On the drive home, Martin felt a quiet satisfaction. Not loss, not nostalgia, but something sturdier. Continuity without control. That evening, Claire came over for dinner. Martin cooked. Nothing fancy. Nothing optimized. Just food that tasted like effort without anxiety. They ate on the porch as the sun dipped low, the neighborhood settling into evening sounds. I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore, Martin said suddenly. For what? Claire asked. For my life to start, he said. I think it already did. I just didn't notice when. She smiled at him across the table. That happens when you stop living in preparation mode. Later, as they sat side by side, shoulders touching, Martin thought about the long arc of his adulthood. The marriage that had been real and right until it wasn't. The years of responsibility that had shaped him without diminishing him. The quiet courage it took to begin again without anger. He hadn't replaced one life with another. He'd expanded. Claire rested her head briefly on his shoulder, not claiming it, just acknowledging it. I'm glad you didn't disappear, she said. So am I, he replied. When she left later that night, Martin didn't feel the old hollow echo of absence. He felt space. Healthy, breathable space. The kind that made room for return. He stood in his kitchen, rinsing plates, listening to the water run. The house still had quiet in it, but it was no longer lonely. It was intentional. Martin Baxter was not reinvented. He was revealed. And for the first time, the life he was living didn't feel like something he owed to anyone else. To fit. Chapter 9. The long view, the first anniversary of the business passed without ceremony. Martin noticed it only because Mark mentioned it in passing while they were locking up one evening. The sun low and gold through the office window. Did you realize it's been a year? Mark said. A year since what? Since we signed the lease. Since you nearly threw up. Martin laughed. I did not nearly throw up. You absolutely did, Mark said. You went very pale. I considered a bucket. They stood there for a moment, taking in the space. Not the raw, uncertain room it had once been, but the lived-in version. Papers stacked with purpose. A whiteboard full of half-erased plans. A rhythm that felt earned. Ha, Martin said. I guess it has been. Mark glanced at him. You good? Martin didn't answer immediately. He let the question settle, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give it the respect of consideration. Yes, he said finally. I am. Not ecstatic. Not triumphant. Just grounded. They parted ways outside, Mark heading toward his car, Martin lingering a moment longer than necessary. The air had that early summer softness to it, the kind that made time feel generous. At home, Martin cooked dinner for one without the familiar edge of loneliness. He ate at the table instead of the counter, a habit he'd picked up without noticing. The house had filled in around him over the past year, not with noise, but with presence. Books stacked where he'd leave them, a chair angled toward the window because that was where the light fell best in the evening. Later, Claire arrived with a bag of strawberries and no agenda. "I found these at the market and thought of you," she said. "That feels like a lot of responsibility for a fruit," Martin replied, taking the bag. They washed and sliced them together, standing shoulder to shoulder at the sink. It was an ordinary moment, unremarkable in every way except how deeply it fit. They sat on the porch as the sky darkened, the neighborhood settling into its nightly exhale. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Someone laughed too loudly and then apologized for it. "I got offered a different position today," Claire said casually, as if she were commenting on the weather. Martin turned to her, attentive but calm. "Oh, same field, different building, more hours, more money, and," she shrugged. "I said I needed time to think." He nodded. "That sounds like you." She smiled. "I wanted to tell you because a year ago I might have said yes immediately, just because it was there, because it felt like progress. And now I'm asking whether it actually fits the life I'm living," she said. "Not the one I think I'm supposed to want." Martin felt a quiet swell of something like recognition. Not pride, exactly, but alignment. "I'm glad you're doing that," he said. "Me too." They sat with that, neither rushing to conclusions or reassurances. That was something they'd learned together. Not everything needed to be decided in the moment it was named. Later, as they cleaned up, Claire leaned against the counter and watched him dry the dishes. "You're different from when I met you," she said. "So are you," he replied. "Yes," she said. "But you're different in a way that feels intentional." He considered that. "I think I stopped treating my life like something I had to justify. That'll do it." After she left, Martin stood alone in the quiet kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator no longer intrusive. He realized something then, not as a revelation but as a settled truth. His life wasn't waiting for the next chapter. It was already being written. A few days later, Pearl came home for a long weekend. She moved through the house with ease, dropping her bag by the stairs, stealing food from the fridge, narrating her life in bursts of enthusiasm and thoughtful pauses. "You've changed the porch," she said, flopping into a chair. "Have I?" "Yeah," she said. "It feels calmer, like you're not bracing for something." Martin smiled. "That's because I stopped." They sat together in the evening light, talking about nothing urgent. About her plans, about his work, about a book she thought he'd like. "You seem happy," she said. "I am," he replied. "Not because everything's perfect, but because it's mine." She leaned her head against his shoulder, brief and familiar. "I like this version of you." "I do too," he said. When she left again, the house returned to its quiet, but it didn't echo. On a Sunday morning not long after, Martin woke early and didn't mind it. He made coffee that tasted right, sat by the window, and watched the street come to life. People passed through the frame of his day, each carrying their own stories, their own unfinished arcs. He thought about the boy he'd been at 18, making promises with sincerity and limited understanding. About the man he'd become through responsibility, love, and endurance. About the person he was now, not newly formed, not rewritten, but revealed. Martin Baxter had loved deeply. He had stayed when staying mattered. He had let go when letting go was kind. And now, finally, he was choosing without obligation, without fear, without erasure. Later, Claire texted him. "Claire, I said no to the job." "Martin, how do you feel?" "Claire, like I listened to myself." "Martin, that's a good feeling." "Claire, come over tonight?" "Martin, I will." Deliberately, he set the phone down and smiled, not because of what was coming, but because of what already was. The quiet after had once felt empty. Now it felt like space. And Martin, standing comfortably inside his own life at last, knew how to fill it, one chosen moment at a time.